What's up, my brothers and sisters and siblings? But no, you're not all related to me. Obviously, none of you are related to me, as far as I know. Hello, everybody. Welcome to AP World History. This is a little bit of a short presentation about how to write a DBQ, a document-based question. There are multiple different videos out there about how to do a DBQ, but this is the model I'm going to have for you in this particular class. And the reason why I have this particular model is it's what you're going to kind of experience next year in AP US history, your junior level class at this fine institution here. So let's go ahead and look at how do you do a DBQ? Well, first of all, that's mostly for that's a different thing. This presentation is found on Canvas or whatever web institution we use these days whenever you're watching this video, but right now it's Canvas. So this presentation is on Canvas. You can follow along, kind of refer to it when you're writing your practice DBQ. But first of all, what is the DBQ? Well, a document-based question. Please, oh, please do not be the person who says the day before the AP, Mr. Ancharsky, what does DBQ stand for? It is document-based question. Basically, the long and short of it is you are writing an essay and your evidence is a series of documents the College Board will give you. You have one prompt. You have one prompt that will come from anywhere between 1450 and the present day. In the past few years or so, it's been the present day. It's been 1800s, early 1900s, that sort of time period. But it could technically come from anything after 1450. So Unit 3 onwards, that's fair game for the DBQ. For the LEQ, remember, you have 3 prompts. You do one of them. For the DBQ, you have one prompt. You better do the one prompt. You have 60 minutes to write, suggested 60-minute writing period for the DBQ. You're given kind of both the LEQ and the DBQ at the same time, like an hour and 30, hour and 40 minutes or so. You spend the first hour working on the DBQ, then you move on to the LEQ. But first 60 minutes, DBQ time. There's a suggested 15-minute planning period time. This is where you organize your documents. This is where you come up with a thesis. This is where you structure your DBQ based on an outline I will provide for you in just a second. You can get started as soon as you want to. The DBQ takes more time. That's why I suggest you do it first. You have 7 documents. And because of actually recent changes to the DBQ from College Board, you technically only need to talk about 4 of them. But I'll talk about why you should talk about at least 6 or 7 of them, actually. But what are the documents to begin with? Well, the documents are primary sources. They are either images, maps, graphs, or short texts. On the day of the AP, the texts are pretty easy to read. At least that's what students in past years have said. There are maps, there are graphs, there are images as well. And basically, your essay, the evidence you use to support your thesis, comes from these 7 documents. Technically, on the day of the AP, you only need to analyze 4 of them. That's the bare minimum. But as practice in this class, you are going to use all but 1. In previous years, that was the case. You use all but 1 of the documents. These years, in 2023, starting this year, we're going to see, or 2024, I guess, is when you take the AP. That is when you're going to use at least 4 documents. This is the score breakdown. You can see this literally any College Board resource for AP World and for any AP history class, actually. Context, thesis, evidence, analysis, and reasoning. And I'll go over each of those points. So this is the suggested format. I'll go into what the body paragraph should look like, but your intro should look like this, basically. This is where you establish context. This is what's either going on during the prompt or what's going on before the period of the prompt. Then you have your thesis. Now, on the day of the AP, if you don't have a conclusion, it's not the end of the world. For this class, for your DBQ exercise, though, since you have more time outside of class and during class, I'm going to expect that you write a conclusion. It's basically a 5-paragraph essay that you do in 60 minutes. And it's a rough draft of a rough draft. It does not need to flow well. It just needs to be coherent. It needs to have some connection to an argument, basically. Now, the practice DBQ that you're going to do for our class is evaluate the extent to which various states between 1450 and 1750 practice religious tolerance. So with this DBQ, there are multiple ways to approach the thesis, as I'll talk about later on. So in that prepping period, that 15-minute prep period, this is what you should basically do. Get started as soon as you want to write, but take time to plan out your DBQ. The DBQ becomes so much easier if you plan it out beforehand and then just plug and chug, just write down full sentences from your outline. So the first 15 minutes, this is what you should do. Read the prompt. Understand what the prompt is asking you to do. And in this case, your prompt is asking you to basically say, to what degree, to what extent did states practice religious tolerance? So the first thing that you should do is basically look at the prompt, understand what it's saying. Then you look at the 7 documents given to you. And kind of with this prompt, basically, I would go through each of the documents and try and understand which ones are asking about tolerance, which ones are intolerant. And you might find that there's more tolerance than there is intolerance, or vice versa. It's up to your interpretation. So I would pick one side, tolerant or intolerant. And then you kind of need to identify 3 categories, 3 reasons why states were either tolerant or intolerant. But the prompt is also asking you to evaluate the extent to which states were tolerant. You can go into this idea that none of these states were tolerant, or at the very least, none of these states practiced true religious freedom. Rather, they merely tolerated these societies. So these are some sample categories that you could go into. You could identify kind of 3 reasons why states would have been intolerant or tolerant. And you can draw from these. You can make your own, obviously. A good way to come up with categories is by narrowing it down based on social, political, economic. That might be a good way to start if you're struggling with the DBQ documents. This is social, this is political, this is economic. Something like that is fine. Now, the first point that I think you can get is contextualization. Contextualization can technically be anywhere in the DBQ, but the stronger DBQs are the ones that establish context first, prior to 1450, during the period 1450 to 1750. And your context needs to be related. It can't just be about trade. It needs to be something about either religion or governments in the case of the sample DBQ that you're going to do in class. So you could say that between 1450 and 1750, states were becoming more centralized, for example. They were practicing ideas like absolutism, for example. You could maybe even say before 1450, there were examples of religiously tolerant states. A good example might be the Mongols, for example. But make sure that no matter what context you give, it is specific, meaning a specific empire, meaning a specific historic process and development, using AP world history terms like centralization, like absolutism, like the Ottoman Empire, something specific. That's what you need in your context. This right here is just an example of something you could talk about. I would pick something else personally, just so you can practice. But this is an example of kind of context of government structures between 1450 and 1750. Between 1450 and 1750, states across Eurasia generally became more centralized. Emerging land-based empires in the Islamic world, like the Ottoman Empire, and the new absolutist monarchs in Western Europe, like Louis XIV in France, look for ways to solidify and justify their rule. Then you define what your thing means. How is it relevant for your discussion about religious tolerance? In this case, I am defining what centralization means. I am defining what absolutism means. And I'm transitioning to my thesis by mentioning that religion was another thing that states had to deal with when centralizing their authority. I have not given a thesis yet. Speaking of which, this is what you should write in your thesis. Your thesis needs to be a defensible claim, meaning someone can take the position that your argument is correct or wrong. This is where you should include things like because, as seen with, in, shown with, etc. You are making an argument. Don't restate your thesis. Don't be simple. Don't restate your thesis. I called you simple. Don't have it a simple thesis. Don't have it be basically states between 1450 and 1750 practice religious tolerance. That's not good enough. You need to go into that. Why did they practice religious tolerance? They practice it these three ways. States between 1450 and 1750 generally practice religious tolerance in order to A, B, C. Three categories, three reasons why states would have practiced religious tolerance. And that's true generally, not just for this prompt, but come up with three reasons why something is true, something is not true. So the DBQ prompt could be, evaluate the extent to which Western European countries impacted the economies of states in Africa and Asia. Well, states in Africa and Asia were impacted by Europe for these three reasons, or through, as seen by these three reasons. Ideally, this should be the last sentence of your intro. That's generally, but for this class, make it so. Make your intro paragraph end with your thesis. Now, if you were in class, we would have played this game right here, kind of which one is good, which one's bad. Well, actually, most of these are acceptable theses. This first one was from your previous LEQ, from Unit 2, actually. The emergence of new states greatly affected networks of exchange, as seen with the Mongols, through their protection of merchants, unifying tax systems, and spreading new technologies. That's fine, but to make it stronger, I would avoid using words like effect, using words like impact or influence. Those are kind of banned words. They promoted, they greatly increased. Things like that would be better. The second thing is just bad. It's bad because while it is taking a stance, it is not explaining how or why states were tolerant. Why might states have practiced religious tolerance? Did they do it for funsies? No, they had specific political reasons why they would have practiced tolerance. Things like creating stability, things like establishing cultural legitimacy, things like having some sort of tax system on different religious minorities. By tolerating different religions within their state, rulers were able to unify their diverse populations with help create stability and prevent religious revolts. That's good, but again, for this class, come up with three reasons why states practiced either tolerance or intolerance. Rulers were intolerant because they believed that allowing the practice of other religions would harm society. Not the worst, but what do you mean by harm? You need to clarify these three categories. All right, so I gave you an example right here. States generally practice religious intolerance in order to justify territorial expansion, centralize political power, and reduce internal conflict. Those are three reasons why some states might have been intolerant. Your evidence is a little tricky because it's not as straightforward as you would think. So you get 1 point for describing specifically content of at least 3 documents. That's it. It's a brief summary, 1 or 2 sentences, referring to specific things from the passages. And I'll describe what describe means in just a second with an example. But you get another point for referencing at least 4 documents altogether. In the past, it was 6 documents altogether. And a reference is basically like a passing kind of reference. And I'll again show an example of what I mean by this in a second. But then finally, you get a point for outside evidence. Outside evidence is something not explicitly mentioned in the prompt,
You can draw this from your notes, well, not on the AP, obviously, but from your memory. You just need to kind of memorize how states dealt with religion. That's one example of the thing you would need to know before the AP exam in May, or whenever you're watching this. Well, it's always in May, no matter where you are. I guess technically you could file for some sort of extension, but there's paperwork involved. Most of you are taking it in May. I would say like 99.99999999999% of you are taking it in May. Anyway, regardless, you should aim for at least one per body paragraph. Technically, you just need one. But again, what if that one example is bad? Well, you have others to fall back on, basically. And use specific things, use proper nouns, use specific historical developments. This is kind of a difference between describe and referencing, when I mean by describing and referencing. This first example right here is an example of description of a document. For example, Ibn Kamal demonstrates the Ottoman court's opinion about the Safavid Empire as a backward and infidel society. Specifically, Kamal refers to Shiaism as a heretical interpretation of Islam, at least compared to Sunni Islam. I am mentioning specific things that are mentioned in the document. In this case, Kamal was talking about how bad Shia Islam was, essentially. Obviously, all religions are valid and equal. The Ottomans and Safavids were particularly hostile towards one another over religious differences, as seen in a letter by Ibn Kamal. That is a reference. You are talking about a document, but not explicitly describing what is in it. That's the difference between referencing and describing. You need to describe 3. You need to reference at least 4 on the AP. For our class, though, you're going to reference 6 altogether. And describing and referencing, if you describe a document, that counts as referencing. All right, if that doesn't make sense, drop a comment down below. But essentially describing specific elements of the content you are summarizing and referencing kind of a passing glance, as seen in the letter, not much detail. All right, you just need to burn this format in your mind. You need to just memorize this basically when you're writing a DBQ. This is the best way to get as many points as possible. On the day of the AP, it's very hard to get 7 out of 7 points. Your goal is to get at least 4 or 5 of those 7 points. 5 is better, 4 isn't bad. If you do super well in the multiple choice, if you do super well in the LEQ and SAQ, then it's fine if you don't get all the points on the DBQ. Honestly, like a 5 out of 7 on the DBQ, a 4 out of 6 on the LEQ, that's not bad. So your body paragraphs, I suggest 3 altogether, using 6 documents. So your body paragraphs look like this, basically. You have a topic sentence. What is this paragraph going to be about? This is from your categories. So say your thesis was states were intolerant. They practiced intolerance in order to establish religion, in order to establish political control. Well, then your topic sentence would be about political control. This is what I mean by political control. This is where I bring up my evidence to support that. So with one document, kind of summarize it in 1 or 2 sentences. What specific content from the document is there? Then you kind of connect, how does that document prove your thesis? Then you are going to identify one aspect of thea. Thea, for the uninitiated, is purpose, historic context, intended audience, author's perspective. Choose one of those things and describe how it might affect your argument. Be explicit. You can say, the purpose of this document is, the intended audience of this author, of this piece is. But kind of give a little bit of a description. How do you see that in the passage? And I'll give an example of this in just a second. Then after that, piece of outside evidence. Then you kind of repeat step 2. But you don't need to describe it necessarily. And then finally end each body paragraph. A lot of you lost points on the LEQ for this. Each body paragraph with historical complexity, explaining how what you just talked about is an example of either continuity or change, explaining how this is similar or different to another society or another time period, explaining how this this event would lead to future developments in world history. That will be easier by the end of this class. Or finally, introducing a counter argument. And you can use your documents as a counter argument. Say you think that there are too many documents about intolerance, and you want your thesis to be about tolerance. Well, you can use a document as an example of a counter argument. But with the counter argument, make sure you explain why your point is stronger, why it is relevant, while this counter example is relevant, but why your particular point is stronger. And honestly, these DBQs and the LEQs, they are not going to be pretty by any extent of the imagination. They're not going to flow well. The AP graders are not generous. They aren't good, benevolent gods, but they do recognize that this is a rough draft of a rough draft. It's not going to look pretty. In your English classes, that's where you worry about your writing looking pretty. In an LEQ, in a DBQ, just make sure it answers the prompt. It explains how evidence supports a thesis. That's the bare thing that they're looking for. All right. So when you're citing evidence, kind of phrase it like this. So for example, say that DBQ was about fast food and teachers' opinions. Don't say something like document B says. No. Say something like, in letter from Mr. Ancharsky, he lists reasons why he will never buy onion rings from Carl's Jr. Document 1. That's your citation. It's kind of like MLA formatting in a way. Cite it with a parentheses. You don't need a reference list or anything. That's already provided for you. So, Doc 1. The AP grader knows you are talking about the first document. And this right here is an example of a reference, actually. I don't describe in detail why I don't want to buy onion rings from Carl's Jr. I would describe that they were soggy, that they are not crunchy like they are supposed to be, for example. That's how you cite a document. You end it with the parentheses document 1. In a rush, saying document B says is fine. Document 1 says is fine. But since you have time to write this practice DBQ, make sure you're citing it like this. Do not quote. Do not quote. Paraphrase what's going on in the document. And just to understand the importance of not quoting, here's another way of saying it. Do not quote. And the reason why I'm emphasizing not quoting is the AP graders know what's in the documents. Quoting's fine in other classes, in English, or I don't know, what other classes do you do essays in? English, Spanish, maybe, French, German, all those wonderful things. Don't quote. As a rule of thumb, in this class, at the very least, do not quote. The AP graders know what is in that document. They want to see your summary. They want to see your analysis. If it's like 1 or 2 or 3 words that you think you cannot shape your own way, then fine, quote that. But don't quote full sentences. They see quotation marks, they don't read it. That's what I do in this class. I see quotation marks. I see that you quoted from the document. I don't read what you just wrote. That's not your own words. So reference the document, describe, paraphrase what's in there, but don't quote. Quote, you should not do. Quoting, for our purposes, is bad. If you quote, you make babies cry. You make God cry if you quote. Obviously, you don't. God loves you. No, I shouldn't say that. It's a public school that we're at here. But, don't quote. All right, I'm going to show you an example of a way, I'll get there later. All right. So kind of this is a way to describe a evidence right here. So some states oppose religions of rival powers as a matter of foreign policy. So that's going to be your topic sentence right there. For example, Ibn Kamal describes the Ottoman court's opinions about the Safavid Empire as a backward and infidel society. Specifically, Kamal refers to Shiaism as a heretical interpretation of Islam. I have not inserted analysis there yet. I have not supported how that would support a thesis that is about religious intolerance, but you can kind of see where I'm going with that. And this is what I mean by outside evidence. The document does not reference the Battle of Chaldiran. That's something we talked about in class. So using kind of what's not explicitly found in the documents, that's going to be the skill of how to get outside evidence. All right, now the analysis time. So on the AP, for a minimum of 2 documents, you need to identify and explain how any of the following are relevant for your argument. So this is the things that the AP are looking for. They are looking for an analysis of either purpose, historical context, intended audience, author's perspective. Choose one of these 4 things. The purpose of this document is to, the historical context of this document is the Protestant Reformation, for example. The intended audience is other Muslims. Well, be more specific than that. Kind of with intended audience, my suggestion is narrow down the empire, narrow down the religion, narrow down the occupation. That's the best way to go for intended audience. Same thing with author's perspective, actually. All right, historical complexity can be any of these things: explaining a counter argument, explaining a comparison with another time period or society. You can't just say something like this. So say the LEQ prompt was explaining how states affected networks of exchange between 1450 and 1750. You can't just say the Mongols' collection of tribute was similar to the Aztecs. You need to describe how it was similar to the Aztecs. You need to describe how this is an example of continuity and change. Do one historical complexity at the end of each body paragraph. But on the AP, actually, you can get historical complexity through different ways. Not only the ways that I described earlier, but also by using all 7 documents as evidence. But you could also do FIA for 4 documents as well, rather than just 2. This right here is an example of how I talked about author's perspective. Kamal's perspective as an official historian for the Ottoman court represents the Ottoman state's identity as a Sunni Islamic caliphate, one that bitterly opposed a rival Shia interpretation. I'm talking about his position in government. He's a Sunni Muslim, more than likely. The political religious rivalry described in the passage represents a continuity in Islamic history, with the Shia-Sunni split revolving around debate concerning the successors of the Prophet Muhammad going back to the mid-600s. I'm explaining how this is something continuing from previous time periods in world history. In the past, Sunnis and Shias were divided because of religious debates. That division continued in the present day, or at least in the 1450 to 1750 time period. This right here is just an example of how I've written it all out. Obviously, I need to talk about another document and analyze it, but this is generally what a body paragraph looks like. Topic sentence, I describe a document, I talk about kind of how this document is relevant to my thesis. The Ottoman Empire engaged in a series of conflicts motivated by religion, best seen with events like the Battle of Chaldiran. Kamal, as an official historian for the Ottoman court, was likely a Sunni Muslim, which explains his negative opinion of a rival Shia interpretation. Another document, the political religious rivalry, blah, 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 goes back to the 600s. But finally, your conclusion. On the AP, conclusion is not necessary. For this practice, I do want you to work with it, though. This is how you do a conclusion. Restate your thesis and do another example of historical complexity. On the AP, a conclusion is not necessary. If you are at the 60-minute marker, stop writing, move on to the LEQ. Make a fire LEQ, then go back if you want to. If you're done with the LEQ, then add a conclusion to the DBQ. But just go ahead and start writing. All right, for your DBQ in class, you have 2 days in class to work on something that on the AP you are given 60 minutes to do. You are going to do all of these things. You're going to write in pen. I don't want anyone to type this. You're going to do an intro. The intro is worth 5 points. You establish your context, that's 2 points, and then your thesis, that's 3 points. Your body paragraphs in total are worth 15 points, 5 per body paragraph. And those points are essentially this. You get a point for describing the content of one document. You analyze FIA for one document. That's another point. You get one piece of historical outside evidence. You get a historical complexity. So you get 5 points for doing this in this class for one paragraph. Then you do it for another. Then you do it for another. Then your conclusion is restating your thesis, give historical complexity. I give you 1 point for restating the thesis, 4 points for historical complexity. So my word of advice is to memorize the outline of how to write an LEQ and a DBQ. They're very similar. Go back, review your notes for how to do an LEQ. Look at this presentation again for how to do a DBQ. That's the outline of what you're supposed to have. And you can move things around. You don't need to analyze FIA for the one that you're referencing. You can do that for the describing bit. But I would more or less follow this model right here. All right. Well, if you have any questions, please let me know in class. That's easier. It's easier for me to talk to you how to write these things rather than sending a big long email. So don't say well, you can say, I don't know how to do this still. And I can work with you to clarify how to do a DBQ. But you need to come to me and ask those questions. I don't know unless you ask. Don't say, this seems really hard without asking for my, not permission, but asking for my advice about these things. Don't say, I don't know how to do this without asking me. If you don't ask, then you don't know. That's kind of the big skill. You need to advocate for yourself. Because honestly, the DBQ is not that hard. Big picture wise, it's not that big of a deal. It's not going to look pretty. And this is a practice that you're doing. So try it. Try it. If you don't do well, that's fine. We can work on this more. We will do this more in class. I will help you out. We can look at examples as well. So just go ahead and try this out. Try this out. Even if it's bad, it's better than nothing. Because in class, we're going to do a peer review of this. We'll look at some model examples of how to do it. Then you'll compare it with your own, basically. All right. Well, let me know if you have any questions, either in class, that's the best one, or during conference period. After school is fine. This is being recorded on the 13th of November. This is going to be due on the 16th, so kind of a few days from now. All right, well, have a great and blessed day. Peace out. I think this is the last video I will ever record for this channel. I said that, a year ago probably, but this is the last video. I'm sure of it. Wow, end of an era. Am I right? Am I right, people? I'm tired. I'm hungry. What do you guys want to eat? I'm really hungry. I could eat a Starburst right now. No, I'll eat a few. You always wonder why it's empty. It's because of me, and I'm eating all of them. And all those seniors, oh my gosh, they steal all my Starbursts. I just despise all of them. And I hate you guys too. I hate the juniors. I'm just filled with hate, I think. That's my author's perspective in making this DBQ. Mr. Ancharsky, as a public school teacher, hates all of his students because he's not paid enough. And he hates them because they don't ask questions, even though he really wants to answer their questions and make sure they understand things. All right. Well, I'm just kidding. I don't hate any of you. Well, I genuinely don't. I don't dislike any of you. I want to work with you. Please feel free to ask questions. I'm rambling now because I want to avoid doing actual work, meaning grading papers and whatnot. But and I need to do that. It's been a while. I need to do your Unit 2 bell works at this point. Obviously, this isn't relevant for people watching in the future in the school year ending in 2025. Oh, I've been teaching for 4 years at this point. Oh, that's gross. Well, I only plan to do 5 years of this. You can bookmark. All right, I've been talking enough. Have a blessed day. Bye. Oh, I didn't stop recording. How do I stop recording? It's been a while. Oh no, I forgot how to stop recording. Okay, stop video. No, it didn't do anything. Choose background. You know, I used to be able to do this. Where are you? Meeting. Stop recording. There we go. Bye.